He had heard her say it 3 weeks ago. She had not said it to him, but had said it to Mrs. Hale behind the dry goods counter in the specific offhand way of someone saying a small, true thing without attaching any weight to it. Mentioning that she had been thinking about her grandmother's lemon cake that morning, that she had not had it in 5 years. And that the missing of it was the specific missing that was not about the food at all. He had been in the back of the store, and she had not known he was there, yet he had filed it the way he filed everything, she said completely, in the interior place where he kept things that mattered. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon when the dust was coming in from the west, and any reasonable man would have stayed inside, he saddled his horse and rode 8 miles through the dust with a lemon cake wrapped in cloth in his saddlebag. Because Mrs. Alderton had the recipe, and he had asked her for it, with sufficient earnestness that she had taken him seriously. And because the riding was not the point, and the cake was not entirely the point, but the point was the specific look on her face when she opened the door. He was right about the face. It was worth every mile of it. Welcome to Cowboy Ironheart. If this already has your heart, let us know you are here. There is a particular kind of woman who learns through the specific instruction of specific circumstances to hold herself at a careful remove from the full weight of her own life. Not because the life is not worth the full weight, not because she is incapable of feeling it, but because the feeling of it in full has, at some specific point in her history, produced consequences that taught her the management, was safer than the feeling, and the remove was more sustainable than the exposure. Sera Whitfield had been that kind of woman for 4 years, and the management had been effective. In the specific sense that it had kept her functional and solvent and forward-moving through the series of events that had produced her arrival in Ember Ridge, Colorado. With her sewing kit and her modest remaining capital, and the particular focused determination of someone who had looked at the available options, and chosen the one that required the most of her, because the ones that required less were the ones that involved stopping. And stopping was not available. She had grown up in a small town in Western Virginia called Harper's Mill, the only child of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had been, but in specific way, of the best kind of domestic intelligence, the organizing center of everything that the household required without appearing to organize anything at all. Her childhood had been genuinely good in the ways that childhoods were genuinely good when they were
delicious.
Warm and somewhat
Glad you
bookish
liked
and
it.
organized around the specific pleasures of a family that was not wealthy, but that was sufficient. That had enough of the things that mattered, and that had not yet encountered the specific insufficient things that the world held in reserve for later. She had been her father's daughter in the most literal available sense, which was that she had inherited his specific relationship with language and with the interior world of books and ideas, and had been reading seriously since she was 7, and had been thinking seriously since she was 9, and had been the kind of girl who was described by the adults around her as an old soul, which was the available vocabulary for someone whose interior life was considerably more developed than her exterior circumstances had yet required it to be. She had also been, from early childhood, her grandmother's granddaughter, and this was the other inheritance, the one that lived not in the mind but in the hands. In the specific tactile intelligence of someone for whom making things was the primary available language of care. Her grandmother had lived 3 streets over in Harper's Mill, in a house that smelled of lavender and butter and the specific warm smell of a kitchen that was used seriously rather than decoratively. And she had taught Sera to sew in the specific apprentice way of someone passing on a genuine craft rather than a domestic accomplishment, teaching her to see fabric as a material with its own logic and its own requirements and its own rewards for the person who paid it the right kind of attention. She had taught her to cook too, including the lemon cake that was the Sunday morning standard of a grandmother's kitchen, which Sera had sat across the table from every Sunday of her childhood with the specific quality of a pleasure that was entirely uncomplicated because the setting of it was entirely safe. Her grandmother had died when Sera was 22. In the spring of the year, Sera met Franklin Whitfield, and the 2 events had happened in such close proximity that she had not been certain, at the time, how much of what she felt for Franklin was about Franklin, and how much was about the specific warmth she had been missing since the Sunday mornings in the kitchen had stopped being available. Franklin was 26 when she met him. That land surveyor who had come to Harper's Mill on a commission and who had the specific appealing quality of someone who had been many places and who carried the wide horizon energy of someone whose life was not contained by the place where they had grown up. He had been interested in her in a way that was flattering and that was genuine, as far as she could determine, and she had been interested in him in a way that was also genuine and that was also she had understood in the retrospective accounting of later years, inflected with the specific quality of someone who had just lost the primary source of warmth in their life and who was, without fully understanding that this was what they were doing, looking for a replacement in a form that was available. They had married within the year, against her father's gentle expressed concern, which was not about Franklin specifically, but about the timing and about the specific quality of a decision made in grief that might look different in the absence of the grief. She had heard the concern and had considered it, and had decided that she was making the right decision, which she had believed at the time, and which she had revisited many times in the 4 years since, and had arrived at an understanding of that was more complicated than either right or wrong, which was that the decision had been made genuinely with the full honest intention of the person she was at 22, and that the person she was at 22 had not yet had the specific experiences that would have allowed her to make it differently. The first 2 years had been the kind of years that were genuinely good while they were happening, and that she looked back on with the specific complicated grief of someone who could not separate the good from what the good had been the prelude to. Franklin had been a warm and interesting companion in those years. He had taken her to places she had not been, and had shown her the wide horizon life she had been attracted to, and had been present with her in the ways that mattered during the years when the ways that mattered were the ways that a young couple building a shared life together required. They had moved twice, following his survey work, and she had built her sewing practice in each new place with the patient, systematic competence that was her characteristic quality. And the practice had followed her, had grown in each new location, because she was very good at the work, and because the goodness of the work was visible to the people who saw it. The third year had been different, not dramatically different, not different in the way of something that announced itself and required immediate response. Different in the slow, accumulating way of things that changed gradually, through the increment of small signs that were individually easy to explain and collectively harder to explain in ways that required only innocuous explanations. Franklin's work had taken him away more frequently, which was not unusual for a land surveyor, and which she had accepted as the ordinary condition of a life organized around that kind of work. The periods of absence had lengthened, which she had also accepted, with somewhat more effort. The quality of his presence during the periods he was home had changed in a way she had noted and had not spoken about, because the speaking of it would have required her to name what she was seeing more directly than she was prepared to name it. And the naming of things was the specific vulnerability she had been managing around since the grief of 22 had taught her that naming what you felt in full was the thing that made the feeling unmanageable. Franklin had died in the 4th year. The illness had arrived quickly and progressed quickly, and the doctor had been competent, and the outcome had been what the outcome was regardless of the doctor's competence. And she had sat in the house in the town where they had most recently been living, and she had felt the complicated things she had been afraid she would feel, which was the grief and the relief and the guilt about the relief all present simultaneously in the specific way of things that were too entangled to address individually. She had not spoken about the entanglement to anyone because speaking of it would have required her to explain the 3rd year and the absences and the specific changes in his presence. And the explaining of it would have required her to say things that were true and that she was not yet ready to make true by saying them. The financial situation had been clarified by the estate process, which had produced information she had not had while Franklin was alive. The survey work had been less continuous than she had understood it to be. The periods of absence had been partially but not entirely explained by the survey commissions she had known about. And the specific amount of capital she had believed was available had been reduced by the specific amount of the discrepancy, which was not negligible. She had done the accounting with the systematic thoroughness she brought to all practical matters and had arrived at a number that was sufficient to start somewhere new if the starting was done carefully, and if the somewhere new was chosen with the specific criteria of someone who needed to establish themselves rather than to maintain something already established. She had chosen Ember Ridge because a connection through the church network had mentioned it as a growing community with a need for skilled trades, which was the same framework that had organized the previous two relocations and that had been reliable in its predictive value for what she needed. She had arrived in January with the sewing kit and the capital and the determination, and she had established herself in the rooms above the dry goods store, and she had set up the practice, and she had begun the process of becoming someone in Ember Ridge, which was the specific process of a woman who understood that a new place was an opportunity to be seen as what she was rather than as what she had been, and who was using the opportunity with everything she had. The work had grown as it always grew through the spring and summer and into the fall, and the accounts were in order, and the rent was paid, and the practice was building the reputation that she had come to understand was the only reliable foundation for the kind of sustainability she needed. She was sewing well, in the specific sense that the work was at the level of her capability rather than at the level of someone operating under the specific depletion of someone who had been spending everything on the getting through. And the getting through was, by the November that was 2 months before the dust storm Thursday, beginning to cost her less than it had in the winter and spring, which she understood as a sign that the worst of the immediate aftermath was behind her, and that what remained was the specific longer-term work of rebuilding an interior life that had been running on emergency reserves for 4 years. She had been thinking about her grandmother more in November, which she understood, with the specific self-awareness she had developed across the 4 years of managing her own interior, as the sign of someone whose resources had recovered enough to permit the kind of grief that was not about the acute emergency, but about the things that had been lost along the way, the quieter losses that had been deferred by the louder ones. The lemon cake craving was that kind of grief, the grief for the Sunday mornings and the kitchen smell and the specific uncomplicated quality of a pleasure that had been entirely safe, which was a quality she had not had available in any pleasure since 22, and which she missed with the specific quality of missing something that you have understood only in retrospect was the most valuable thing you had at the time. You had it. She had mentioned it to Mrs. Hale without thinking about it, had been at the dry goods counter buying thread, and had been in the specific small open quality that sometimes produced in comfortable, undemanding social situations. The quality of someone who was off guard in a benign way. And the lemon cake thought had come out with the specific naturalness of something that was not being managed because the management had briefly, and for good reason, relaxed. She had not known Colt Maren was in the back of the store. She had not thought about the mentioning of it again. She had gone back to the rooms above the dry goods store and gone back to the work and gone back to the specific forward-facing management of the daily life. And the lemon cake had remained in the interior place where it had always been, the specific warm ache of something small and irreplaceable and gone. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon in December when the dust was coming in from the west and she was at the work table with the current commission and the lamp burning against the early dark, someone knocked on her door. She was not expecting anyone. She went to the door with the specific quality of someone who had not been expecting anyone, and who was therefore entirely unprepared for what was on the other side of it. What was on the other side of it was Colt Maren, 6'5" of him, covered in dust from the 8 miles and the storm, holding something wrapped in cloth with both large hands, with the warm, dark brown eyes that she had been aware of for 11 months and that were in the doorway of her rooms in the December dust storm light. The specific expression they made when he was entirely certain about something and was not performing the certainty, but simply inhabiting it. And what he held in both hands, wrapped in cloth, was the specific smell that reached her before she had even registered what it was. The smell of lemon and butter and the specific warm smell of a Sunday morning kitchen that she had not smelled in 5 years. She had not managed her response to that. There was no management available for that. There are men who listen in the specific way that most people do not listen, which is the way that retains what was said rather than simply processing it for the immediate purpose of the conversation and releasing it afterward. Men for whom the things people said in their presence were not the raw material of a social exchange to be consumed and discarded, but the specific evidence of who the person was and what they carried and what mattered to them, to be held carefully in the interior place where such evidence accumulated into understanding over time. Colt Maren was that kind of listener, and the specific quality of his listening was not a practice skill and was not a social strategy, but was simply how he engaged with the world. The natural expression of someone for whom other people were genuinely interesting in the specific deep way that produced. I am a man who had been paying that quality of attention to a particular woman for 11 months, a thorough and accurate knowledge of that woman that she herself did not know she had provided. He had grown up in the eastern part of Colorado, the second of 3 sons in a ranching family that had been working the same high country land for 1 generation and that had the specific relationship with work and weather and the land itself that a generation of hard, sustained attention produced in the people who paid it. His father had been a man of considerable practical intelligence and genuine warmth, who had communicated what mattered through the quality of what he did and who had been present in the specific way that Colt had understood, only in the retrospective accounting of adulthood, was not the ordinary thing it had felt like in childhood, but was the specific gift of a father who understood that presence was not the same as proximity and who had made the distinction every day. His mother had been a woman of dry humor and considerable competence, and the specific quality of someone who noticed what was needed before it was asked for, and she had produced in Colt, through that quality and through the observation of it across his formative years. The understanding that care was expressed most accurately, not through the large announced gestures, but through the small specific ones that required the sustained attention to another person that produced the knowledge of what was actually needed. He had been large since early adolescence and had managed the size with the specific patient quality of someone who had understood early that large was not the same as imposing. That the distinction was made not through the size itself, but through how the size was carried. And he had spent 34 years carrying it with the deliberate, unhurried quality that was his characteristic mode of occupying all spaces, which was the quality of someone who was entirely at home in his own dimensions and who had made his peace with them decades ago without residual self-consciousness. He was good at the ranch work in the specific fundamental way of someone whose body was well suited to the demands of it and who had the patience to do the work correctly rather than quickly, which was the distinction his father had drawn early, and which had settled into him as a permanent operating principle that extended well beyond the ranch work into everything he did. He had come to Ember Ridge 4 years ago through the specific convergence of available land and available capital and the particular restlessness of a man who had been working other people's operations for the better part of a decade and who had arrived at the understanding that what he needed was not more experience of ranching, but a specific piece of ground that was his own to work in, the way that his understanding of the work required. The Maren spread 8 miles outside of town had been available and had been in the specific assessment he had given it before purchasing exactly what it appeared to be, which was 40 acres of good grazing land with solid water and adequate infrastructure, and the specific quality of a place that had not yet been shaped by sustained, careful management, and that was waiting for someone to provide it. 4 years of sustained, careful management had produced an operation that was working well in the specific sense of working the way he had intended it to work when he had sat with the purchase paperwork and thought about what the 4 years would require. The cattle were healthy and the fences were in good repair, and the accounts were in order, and the specific daily satisfaction of a piece of work done correctly was available to him in the mornings, when he walked the spread and saw the evidence of what 4 years of consistent attention had built. He was not a man who required external acknowledgement of what he had built. The internal acknowledgement of having done a thing correctly was sufficient, which was a quality he had inherited from his father, and that had served him well across a life that had not always offered the external acknowledgement in proportion to the effort. He came to Ember Ridge twice a month for supplies, always on the same days, which was the first and third Wednesday, which was the schedule he had established in the first year, and that had been maintained by the specific efficiency of having a reliable schedule rather than by any strong preference for Wednesdays. He had first seen Sera Whitfield in her second month in Ember Ridge, which was March, when she had been in the dry goods store buying thread with the focused practical attention of someone who was doing a commercial errand efficiently rather than socially, and he had registered her with the specific comprehensive attention he gave to most things, and what he had registered had not settled in him, the way the light things settled, which is briefly and without particular weight, but had settled the way significant things settled, which was with a specific quality of gravity that told him, without his having made any analysis of the telling, that this was something he was going to return to rather than file and forget. He had returned to it across the following 9 months in the specific way he returned to things that deserved sustained attention, which was through the consistent accumulation of observation across the repeated occasions that Ember Ridge's social and commercial geography provided. He had seen her in the dry goods store and on the main street and at the church social in September and at the harvest gathering in October, and he had been filing the accumulated impressions with the patient thoroughness of someone for whom the understanding of a person was a project undertaken over time rather than a conclusion drawn from insufficient evidence. He knew the specific quality of her attention when she was doing her work. He knew how she talked to Mrs. Hale at the dry goods counter, which was with the specific, slightly more open quality of someone who was genuinely comfortable in a comfortable situation and who allowed the comfort to express itself without the management she usually applied to her social interactions. He knew the way she walked the main street of Ember Ridge with the focused forward quality of someone who was going somewhere for a specific purpose and who was not pausing to be seen, which told him something about her relationship with public space and with being observed. He knew the specific quality of her rare smile, which he had seen twice across the 9 months prior to the lemon cake conversation. Once at the harvest gathering when a child had done something involving a dog that had been genuinely funny, and once at the church social, when Mrs. Alderton had said something dry and unexpected, and both times the smile had been the specific thing that stopped whatever was happening in the vicinity of it. Not because it was performed or because it was directed at anyone, but because it was entirely genuine and entirely unguarded, and was therefore that in the specific way of things that were entirely genuine and entirely unguarded, more present than most things. He had been thinking about her smile for 9 months, and he was willing to be honest with himself about this fact. Because dishonesty with himself was not a mode he had cultivated and was not one he was going to start cultivating at 34 Tom. He was also thinking about her in the other ways that sustained careful attention over 9 months of consistent observation produced. Thinking about the specific quality of someone managing alone in a new place. The specific contained quality of someone who had organized themselves tightly against a loss that they had not yet fully processed. The specific quality of someone whose interior life was considerably larger than the exterior she permitted the world to see, which he had been able to read across the 9 months from the specific small signs that were available to someone paying the right kind of attention. He had been in the back of the dry goods store on the Wednesday in November when she had been at the counter, had been in the section where the tool supplies were kept, which was at the back left of the store, and he had heard her voice with the specific quality it had when she was in the slightly more open mode that the dry goods counter sometimes produced in her. And he had heard what she said about the lemon cake with the complete attention that was his characteristic quality, which meant he had heard not just the words, but the specific interior of the words, which was the interior of someone who was grieving something small and irreplaceable, and who had said it out loud without weight because she had not been planning to, and because the comfortable situation had briefly relaxed the management that would ordinarily have prevented the saying. He had filed it in the interior place with the specific quality he gave to things, she said, that were worth keeping, which was the quality of someone who understood that the small, true things people said without weight were often the most accurate available information about what they actually needed, and that the person who heard those things and remembered them and did something about the remembering was providing a specific form of care that was different in kind from the care that responded to stated needs, because it was the care that had been listening closely enough to hear the unstated ones. He had thought about the lemon cake for 3 weeks. Not obsessively, not with the quality of someone who had made it into a project that superseded everything else, but with the patient returning consideration he gave to things that he was still in the process of determining what to do with. He had considered the various forms the doing something could take, had considered the version that was anonymous, and had understood that the anonymous version was wrong. Because the point was not the cake, but the knowing that someone had been listening, and the knowing required a specific face to receive it from. He had considered the version that was arranged through an intermediary, and had understood that this was also wrong for the same reason. He had thought about the 8 miles and the December weather, and the specific fact that Thursday was not a supply day, and that arriving on a non-supply day was itself a form of information about the purpose of the arrival. And he had decided that the information was the right kind of information to provide, and that the Thursday was the right day. He had gone to Mrs. Alderton on the Tuesday before the Thursday, had found her at the church auxiliary meeting and had pulled her aside with the specific earnestness of a large man, making a sincere request that he understood might seem unusual, and that he was not going to apologize for because he did not apologize for sincere requests. He had told her that he needed the recipe for a lemon cake, that it was a specific kind, the kind that was butter-heavy and not too sweet, and that was made with real lemon and not lemon extract, and that he needed Mrs. Alderton specifically because she was the best baker in Emberridge, and because the version he needed was the version that was made correctly. Mrs. Alderton had looked at him for a long moment with the specific assessment of a woman who had been making lemon cake for 40 years and who understood immediately that this was not a supply request, but was something else entirely. And she had said she would make the cake on Wednesday evening and have it ready Thursday morning. And he had thanked her with the specific plain gratitude he expressed for things that genuinely warranted it. He had picked up the cake on Thursday morning wrapped in the cloth Mrs. Alderton had provided, which was a clean cotton square tied at the top with the specific careful presentation of someone who understood that the wrapping mattered as much as what was wrapped. He had put it in the saddlebag with the care of someone transporting something that was more fragile than its physical dimensions suggested, not the cake itself, which was sufficiently dense to survive a reasonable amount of motion, but the specific thing the cake represented which required the same care. He had ridden out at mid-morning with the sky already showing the specific brown-yellow quality at the western horizon that told him the dust was coming in and that the ride back was going to be more unpleasant than the ride there. And he had assessed this information and had factored it into the calculation and had determined that it was not a relevant variable in the decision. Because the decision had not been made on the basis of weather conditions and was not going to be unmade by them. The dust had been moving in seriously by the time he reached the halfway point. The specific quality of a Colorado December dust storm that was not the worst kind, but was the kind that required a bandana over the mouth and a hat pulled low, and the patient endurance of someone who had ridden in this before and understood that the endurance was the only available response. He had endured it with the unhurried practicality of a man for whom the weather was a condition to be managed rather than a problem to be dramatized. And he had arrived at the main street of Emberridge with the dust on his coat and the coat on his back and the cake in the saddlebag and the specific quality of someone who had come a long way through a difficult thing for a specific reason and who was entirely at peace with the having come. He tied the horse at the post outside the dry goods store, and he took the wrapped cake from the saddlebag with the same care he had used putting it in. And he walked up the outside staircase to the rooms above the store, and he knocked on the door with the large calloused hand that was covered in the dust of 8 miles and the dust of the storm, and that was, in the December afternoon, the hand of a man who had ridden through a dust storm for a reason that was the specific reason it was, which was that she had said something without weight 3 weeks ago, and he had been listening closely enough to hear it, and the hearing of it had made the riding a simple and available thing that any man who had been listening that closely would have done. She opened the door. He held out the wrapped cloth. He said, "Mrs. Hale mentioned you were in the store on Wednesdays, so I left this with her first, and then thought better of it, because I thought you should know who brought it." He said it with the plain quality of a man who had thought through the approach and had arrived at the honest version of it, which was the version where the point was visible rather than hidden behind the anonymity of the delivery mechanism. She looked at him. She looked at the cloth. She looked at him again. She said, "Is that?" He said, "Mrs. Alderton made it." He said, "From the original recipe." He said, "I asked her specifically about the butter proportion, and she said the key was real lemon and not extract, and twice the amount of butter most recipes called for." She stood in the doorway with the cloth in her hands and the smell of lemon and butter arriving from it in the cold air, and her gray-blue eyes doing something that he had not seen them do before, which was the specific thing that happened to eyes that were very carefully managed when the management encountered something it had not been built to handle, which was the thing that was too small to require management and too specific to deflect with it. He said, "Your smile is worth the whole ride." He said it with the plain, unhurried quality he used for the things that were true and that he had decided deserved to be said plainly. And she stood in the doorway with the lemon cake and the gray-blue eyes and the specific expression that was the beginning of the smile that stopped things. And he stood in the dust, and the December cold, and he was right about all of it, and he knew he was right, and the knowing of it was entirely sufficient. She did not manage it. That was the specific thing about the lemon cake and the doorway, and the man standing in the December dust with his coat covered in 8 miles of it. There was no management available for something that had arrived in the specific form it had arrived in, which was the form of something too small to require management and too precisely aimed at the specific interior of her to be deflected by the management she had been applying to her exterior for 4 years. She had been managing things successfully for 4 years, had been managing the grief and the accounting of the marriage and the specific complicated interior of the months following Franklin's death, and the starting over and the new town and the building of the practice, and the daily careful maintenance of the version of herself that was functional and forward-facing and sufficient to the demands of her life. She'd been managing all of it correctly, in the sense that everything that needed to be operational was operational, and everything that needed to be maintained was maintained. And the lemon cake had arrived in the form of something that her management system had no protocol for, because her management system had been built to handle things that were large and difficult. And the lemon cake was small and specific, and entirely good in the way of things that were entirely good without complication. And the management of things that were entirely good without complication had not been something she had needed for a long time. She stood in the doorway for a moment with the cloth in her hands, and the smell reaching her in the way that smell reached you when it was connected to something deep enough in the memory that the connection bypassed the conscious mind entirely, and arrived directly at the interior in the specific form of the thing it was the smell of, which was not just lemon cake in the abstract, but specifically Sunday mornings in the kitchen in Harper's Mill, and the specific warmth of her grandmother's house and everything that the warmth of her grandmother's house had contained, which was the last place she had felt entirely safe in the specific, uncomplicated way of safety that did not require vigilance. She had not smelled that smell in 5 years. She had not expected to smell it on a Thursday afternoon in a dust storm in a Colorado town she had been in for 11 months. She had not prepared for it. She said, "Come in out of the dust." She said it with the specific practical quality of someone who had decided that the managing of the moment was not available, and who was therefore defaulting to the available practical response, which was that a man had ridden 8 miles through a dust storm and was standing in the December cold, and the obvious thing was to invite him inside and offer him something warm. He came in with the unhurried deliberateness of his characteristic movement, angling his shoulders through the doorway in the specific automatic way of a man who had been navigating door frames built for smaller people for his entire adult life and who had made the accommodation entirely unconscious. And he removed his hat with the hand that was not holding his coat, which he had shaken at the door to reduce the amount of December dust he was bringing into her rooms. And he stood in her front room with the hat in his hand and the warm, dark brown eyes looking at the space with the same attentiveness they gave to most things, which was the attentiveness of someone who was genuinely interested in what a space told them rather than performing the interest. Her rooms were what they were. Modest and functional and organized with the specific efficient intelligence of someone who had made the space work for its purpose and for hers without excess and without apology. The work table was positioned to catch the light from the east window in the mornings, which was the good light for fine work. The shelf of books above the window was the one space she had arranged with something approaching personal preference rather than pure function. The books were the things she had carried from every move because they were the one category of possession that she had consistently refused to reduce below a certain threshold, which had produced, over the moves, a collection that told the story of her interior life more accurately than anything else in the rooms. The sewing work was on the work table where she had left it when she went to the door, a piece she had been doing the fine detail on, with the thread and the needles arranged in the specific order that was her working order and the lamp burning against the early dark that the dust had brought on. He took all of it in with the comprehensive, unhurried attention he gave to everything she related to, and she watched him take it in from the kitchen doorway where she had moved to put the kettle on. And she observed the looking with the specific awareness of someone who was not certain what they were watching, and who was not going to make a decision about what they were watching until they had more information. She said, "Sit wherever you fit." He looked at the available chairs with the practical eye of a large man assessing spatial options and chose the straight-back chair by the work table, which was the most structurally sound of the available options, and he sat in it with the careful economy of movement that was his characteristic quality. She unwrapped the cloth at the kitchen counter while the kettle heated. The cake was whole and was, she could see, even from the brief inspection, she permitted herself before she set it on the board, exactly what the smell had promised. The specific dense golden color of a lemon cake made correctly, with the slight sheen on the top that meant the glaze had been applied while it was still warm, which was the step her grandmother had always insisted was the one that most people missed. She stood with her hands on the counter and the cake on the board, and she allowed herself, for the specific moment that she allowed it, the full weight of what the smell was doing to her interior, which was the thing she had been not feeling for 5 years in the way she had been not feeling most things. And then she made the tea with the practiced efficiency of someone who was doing a familiar thing well, and she put 2 cups on the tray with the cake board and carried it into the front room. She set the tray on the table between her chair and his, and she sat. And she looked at him across the small table with the gray-blue eyes doing the full assessment of someone who was going to ask the questions the situation required. She said, "How did you know?" He said, "I was in the back of the store 3 weeks ago." She said, "I didn't know you were there." He said, "I know." She said, "I was talking to Mrs. Hale." He said, "I know." She said, "I wasn't saying it to anyone in particular." He said, "I know that too." He said, "I was there, and I heard it, and I remembered it." She said, "For 3 weeks." He said, "Yes." She said, "And then you rode 8 miles in a dust storm." He said, "It wasn't a dust storm when I left." He said, "It became a dust storm about halfway." She said, "And you kept going." He said the cake was already in the saddlebag. He said it with the dry, plain quality that was his version of humor. And she registered it with the specific quality of someone encountering something they had not expected to encounter from this specific person in this specific moment. She said, "Why did you tell me it was you?" He said, "Because I thought about not telling you, and it seemed dishonest." He said, "The point wasn't the cake being on your doorstep." He said, "The point was you knowing that someone had been listening." She looked at him across the tray in the lamplight, and the gray-blue eyes were doing the careful, specific work of someone receiving information about the quality of what was in front of them, processing it honestly rather than through the filter of what would be most manageable. She said, "That is a very specific distinction." He said, "I'm a specific person." She said, "I've been told that." He looked at her. She said, "I'm telling myself that." She said it with the quality of someone making a small, unexpected, honest admission in the way she sometimes made them in comfortable situations. And it was there and then it was finished, in the way that those admissions were finished before the management reinstated itself. And he received it with the same plain quality he received everything she offered, which was completely without requiring it to be more than it was. She poured the tea. She cut 2 pieces of the cake and set one in front of him and held her own plate for a moment without eating from it. Just held it and looked at the specific color and the specific smell and the specific fact of the thing. He waited. He had the specific quality of someone for whom waiting was not impatience managed, but genuine ease with the pace that things required. And she registered the waiting with the specific awareness of someone who was accustomed to people requiring her to move at the pace that was convenient for them and who was encountering, not in the patience of the waiting, something that was different from that. She ate a piece of the cake. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her with the warm, dark brown eyes from across the table, not intrusively, not with the quality of someone monitoring her response for information about how the gesture had landed, but with the genuine interested attention of someone who found the person in front of them worth watching in the specific way that was about the person rather than about what the person's response told him. She said, "It's right." He said, "Mrs. Alderton is the best baker in the valley." She said, "I don't mean the quality." She said, "I mean it's right." He said, "Yes." He said it with the same plain quality as the simple confirmation of something he had known, and she had just confirmed. She said, "My grandmother made it with real lemon." He said Mrs. Alderton was very specific about the lemon. She said, "The glaze too." She said, the glaze went on warm. She said, yes. She said it, and she looked at the cake plate for a moment, and then she looked at him and said, "How did you know about the butter?" He said, I asked. She said, "You asked specifically about the butter proportion." He said, "I wanted it to be right." She said, "Most people would have just bought a cake from the bakery." He said, "Most people didn't hear what you said about it." He said it with the plain quality, and she held the plain quality for a moment, and then she said, "What did you hear?" He said, "I heard someone who had lost something small and specific that they had not had room to grieve properly among the larger things they were grieving." He said, "And I heard that the something small was connected to a person they had loved, and that the losing of the person had made the something small irreplaceable in a way it had not been while the person was alive." She looked at him with the gray-blue eyes in the lamplight, and the dust storm pressed against the windows with the specific sound of December dust on glass. That was the sound of the outside world doing what it did with the specific indifference of the external world to the interior events of two people in a small room above a dry goods store. And she said, "That is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." He said, "Tell me about her," she said. "My grandmother." He said, "Yes." She said, "You want to hear about her?" He said, "You've been carrying her around for 5 years without anyone to put her down with." He said, "I'd like to hear about her." She looked at him for a long moment with the specific quality of someone who has been offered something they had not known was on offer, and who is still in the process of determining whether to receive it. Then she said she smelled like lavender and butter. He said, "Tell me more." And she did. She told him about the kitchen in Harper's Mill, and the Sunday mornings, and the specific warmth of a place where everything had been simple and sufficient and entirely good. And he listened with the complete quality that was his specific gift, receiving everything she offered, without requiring it to be in a particular form or to arrive at a particular pace. Simply present with the receiving in the way that she was beginning to understand was simply how he was present with most things. The dust storm continued outside. The lamp burned its steady amber. The tea went slightly cold in the cups, and neither of them noticed or cared. She talked about her grandmother for longer than she had talked about anything that was purely interior and not functional in 11 months. And he listened for the full duration and asked the questions that told her he had understood not just the content, but the specific emotional landscape she was describing. And the questions had the quality she was learning to recognize as characteristic of him, which was the quality of someone genuinely curious about the specific rather than the general, who wanted to know the particular detail rather than the broad outline, because the particular detail was where the actual person lived. He stood to leave when she had been talking for over an hour, stood with the unhurried deliberateness of his characteristic movement, and gathered his hat and his coat, and he said, "The storm will be settled by morning." He said, "The ride home will be better than the ride here." She said, "I could have told you that. Before you came," he said. "You couldn't have." He said, "The ride here was necessary," she said, "Colt." He said, "Yes," she said, "Thank you." He said, "You're welcome." He said it simply, and he put on his hat with the one-handed motion that had produced the specific dent in the left side of the crown. And he moved toward the door with the deliberate ease of his characteristic movement. And she stood in the front room with the empty cake plate and the cold tea and the specific quality of someone who has been unexpectedly reached by something in a place they had not been reached in a very long time. And she said, "Come back on a Wednesday." He stopped with his hand on the door. He said, "First or third?" She said, "First." He said, "All right." He went out into the dust that was settling as he had said it would, and she closed the door and stood in the front room for a long moment in the specific quality of someone who has just been through something that they had not anticipated, and that they are not yet certain what to do with, but that they are very certain they are not going to manage away. She cut another piece of the cake and sat at the work table and ate it slowly with the lamp burning and the storm quieting outside. And she thought about her grandmother and about the kitchen in Harper's Mill and about the man who had ridden 8 miles through a dust storm because he had been listening closely enough 3 weeks ago to hear something she had said without weight, and who had done something about the hearing that was exactly the right thing, and nothing more and nothing less. She thought about what it meant to be heard in that specific way, not the general hearing of someone paying polite social attention. Not the performative hearing of someone who wanted to appear to be listening, but the specific hearing of someone for whom what she said was genuinely the most important thing currently occurring, and who had retained it across 3 weeks and had acted on it with the specific plain sincerity of someone for whom the action was simply the available expression of having heard. She had not been heard in that way in a very long time. She was not certain she had ever been heard in quite that way. She sat with the cake and the lamp and the quieting storm, and she let herself feel the specific quality of what the afternoon had been, without the management. Without the careful interior maintenance she applied to things that threatened to be too much. She let it be what it was, which was something small and entirely good. And she let it be that way, for the full duration of the evening. It was the first evening in 11 months that she had let something be entirely good without immediately assessing the cost of letting it be that. The cost, she discovered, was nothing. The good was simply good. She finished the cake and went to bed and slept the specific sleep of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and who has for one evening set a portion of it down. She was at the work table the next morning before the light came up, as she was every morning, but the morning had a different quality than the mornings before it. A quality she did not name because naming it would have required her to commit to an understanding of it that she was not yet ready to commit to. But that she noted in the specific careful way. She noted things that were different and that deserved attention. She noted it, and she let it be there, and she went back to the work. The first Wednesday was 10 days away. She was aware of the 10 days with the specific awareness of someone who is not counting them and who is entirely aware that they are not counting them. He came on the first Wednesday as he had said he would come, which was the specific plain fact of him showing up where he said he would show up at the time. He said he would show up there. And she received this fact with the specific quality of someone who had been paying attention to the difference between what people said they would do and what they actually did for long enough that the alignment of the two things in a single person registered as information rather than as the unremarkable baseline she had once assumed it was. He arrived at the dry goods store at his usual supply hour, which was mid-morning, and he completed his supply errands with the focused efficiency of someone who had a list and was working through it. And then he came up the outside staircase and knocked on her door, and she opened it with the specific quality of someone who had not been waiting for the knock, and who had been aware of the 10 days with the awareness of someone who was not counting them. She made tea. He sat in the straight-backed chair by the work table that had become from the single previous occasion, the chair that was his in the specific way that things became yours when you had occupied them once with the right quality of presence. She sat across from him, and they talked with the specific quality of a conversation that was not a first conversation and was not yet the settled conversation of two people who had established all the available ground between them, but was the specific second conversation that had the quality of two people who had said enough in the first conversation to know that there was more worth saying. She asked him about the ranch. Not with the polite social inquiry of someone filling the conversational space, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who had understood from the first conversation that the ranch was the primary organizing fact of his daily life and who was interested in the specific truth of it. He told her about the cattle and the specific challenges of the December rotation, about the fence section on the north boundary that had been giving him intermittent trouble across the fall and that he had been addressing in the systematic way of someone who preferred the thorough solution to the repeated patch, and about the specific quality of the high country winter that was different from what he had expected when he had first come to Colorado from the eastern part of the state. She listened with the full attention she gave to things she found genuinely interesting. And the specific way she listened was something he had been observing across the 9 months of the Supply Wednesdays, and that he was now observing at closer range, which revealed details that the Wednesday at the counter distance had not permitted. She listened with her whole face, not performing the listening in the way of someone who had learned that the performance of attentiveness was socially productive, but with the genuine interior engagement of someone for whom the thing being described was actually interesting and who was actually trying to understand it. She asked questions that told him the genuineness was real. The questions were the questions of someone who had understood what he said and wanted to know more about the specific thing rather than the general category. And he answered them with the specific pleasure of someone who was accustomed to talking about the ranch to people whose interest was polite rather than actual, and who was discovering what it felt like to talk about it to someone who was actually interested. He asked her about the current commission, and she told him about it with the specific animation that appeared in her voice when she talked about work she was engaged with, about the particular challenge of the fabric the client had chosen and the specific technique she was using to address the challenge, about the way the commission had presented her with a problem she had not encountered before, and that she had been working out the solution to across the previous week. He listened with the complete quality and asked the questions that told her he had understood the specific technical content of what she was describing, even though the specific technical content was the technical content of fine sewing work, which was not a field he had any direct experience of, and she understood from the quality of his engagement with the technical content that the engagement was about her and about the way she moved through a problem rather than about the problem itself, which was the specific form of attention that was interested in the person rather than the subject. The Wednesday visits became the rhythm of the weeks that followed. He came on the first and third Wednesdays as his supply schedule provided. And he came up the outside staircase, and she made tea, and they sat in the front room in the specific arrangement that had established itself from the first visit, which was the straight-back chair, and her chair, and the small table between them, and they talked for the length of time that the conversation required, which was sometimes an hour and sometimes longer, and once was almost 2 hours before either of them registered the duration. The conversations had the quality she had been learning to recognize as the specific quality of what happened when two people who were both genuinely interested in the world and in each other found themselves regularly in the same space with sufficient time to talk honestly. The conversations generated the material for the next conversation in the specific way of conversations that were not exhausting themselves, but were deepening, adding to the shared interior landscape rather than circling around the surface of it. He brought small things, sometimes not always, and not with any pattern that she could predict, which meant the bringing was not a routine, but was the specific expression of someone who noticed things and acted on the noticing when the acting was available. He brought a small packet of the specific thread color she had mentioned once being difficult to source in Ember Ridge, which he had found at the dry goods in the county seat on a day he had ridden out there for a different purpose and had remembered because she had mentioned it, and remembering her mentions was simply what he did. He brought a book once, a specific title she had referred to obliquely in passing as something she had been wanting to read, that he had found at the bookseller in the county seat on the same trip, and that he had brought without announcement, setting it on the work table when he arrived, as though it were simply a practical object being returned to its proper location. She had looked at the book and then at him and had said, "You went to the county seat." He had said, "I had business there." She had said, "And you remembered the book." He had said, "I remember things you mention." She had said, "That is the most specific quality I have encountered in a person." He had said, "It's just attention." She had said, "Most people don't pay it." He had said, "That's their loss." He said it with the dry, plain quality, and she had looked at the book in her hands and had felt the specific quality of something moving through her that she was managing less carefully than she had been managing things in the months before December. She had been managing things less carefully since December. This was the fact she had been noting with the specific careful attention she gave to changes in her own interior, which was the attention of someone who had been monitoring themselves for 4 years as a practical necessity and who had not entirely stopped monitoring even as the acute necessity had reduced. The monitoring told her that the careful management was loosening in the specific incremental way of things that loosened when the conditions for the loosening were right. And she was honest enough with herself to understand that the conditions that were right were the Wednesday visits and the specific quality of the man in the straight-back chair, who had been providing across the December and January weeks the consistent daily evidence of someone for whom showing up was not a gesture but a baseline, and for whom remembering what she said was not a strategy but simply how he operated. She told him more in January than she had told him in December, not the large things, not the full interior accounting of the 4 years and everything they had contained, but the things that were adjacent to the large things, and that came out in the natural direction of conversations that were moving, honestly. She told him about Harper's Mill and her father, and the specific quality of a bookish childhood that had not prepared her particularly well for the practical demands of a frontier life, and that had prepared her very well for the interior demands of a difficult one. He listened with the complete quality and asked the questions that showed he had understood the specific territory she was describing, and she found, in the finding of herself telling him these things, that the telling was producing something different from what she had expected, which was not the specific vulnerability of disclosure, but the specific relief of someone setting down a thing they had been carrying alone, which was a different quality and one she had not experienced in some time. He told her things in January, too. Not the general biographical facts of the kind that people exchanged in the early stages of an acquaintance, but the specific interior things that were the evidence of who someone actually was at the level that mattered. He told her about the Montana years when he had been working other people's operations, and about the specific quality of a life organized entirely around someone else's land that had produced in him. Gradually and then decisively, the understanding that what he needed was his own piece of ground to manage his own way. Not for the vanity of ownership, but for the specific satisfaction of the alignment between what he understood about how the work should be done and how the work was actually being done. He told her about the 4 years of building the Maren, spread from an operation that had potential to an operation that was working the way he had intended it to work. And the telling had the quality of someone describing the primary project of their life with the specific mixture of satisfaction and ongoing commitment of someone who was not finished with it but was at the stage where the results were visible and the results confirmed the approach. She said one January Wednesday, when the conversation had moved in this direction, "You know exactly who you are." He looked at her across the small table. She said, "I mean that as the highest possible compliment." She said, "Most people don't." He said, "Most people don't take the time to find out." She said, "How did you find out?" He considered this honestly. He said, "I spent a long time doing work that required me to be accountable for the outcome to someone else's standards." He said, and the doing of that for long enough made the question of my own standards into something urgent. He said, "When you can't point to the thing you built and say that it reflects what you actually think is the correct approach, you start to understand that the correct approach matters to you." He said, and the understanding of that is the beginning of the rest of it. She said, "The rest of knowing who you are." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm not sure I've gotten there." He said, "You're further along than you know." She said, "What makes you say that?" He said, "Because the people who have gotten there show it in the quality of their work." He said, "And your work is excellent." She looked at him and said, "That is a very specific way to assess an interior condition." He said, "I told you I'm specific." She said, "You did." She said, "I keep finding out you meant it." The tension that was building across the January weeks had the specific quality of something that was real and that was not being rushed and that was not being deflected. Something that was being allowed to be what it was, at the pace it was being what it was, which was the specific pace of two people who each had sufficient history to understand that the important things required the time they required. She was aware of him across the small table, with the specific awareness of someone who had been managing their awareness and who was managing it less carefully now, who was allowing more of the awareness to be present than she had been allowing in the early Wednesday visits. He was aware of her with the same comprehensive patient attention that was his characteristic quality, and she had begun to be able to read the specific quality of the attention, which was the reading of someone who had been paying close attention to how the attention expressed itself across the weeks and who had enough accumulated examples to begin to understand the vocabulary of it. The attention was not the same as wanting something from her. The attention was the specific form of investment that preceded and accompanied genuine care, the investment of someone who found the person they were attending to worth the attending, who was organized around the attending rather than around the outcome the attending might produce. She had not been attended to in that way before. Or she had once. But the attending had been the attending of her grandmother rather than of someone who was present in the specific way of someone for whom her daily life was a matter of direct daily interest. The grandmother's attending had been warm and complete and had been the foundation of the feeling she was missing, and the Wednesday attending was something different but in the same register, was the same category of thing expressed in a different and more complex and more mutual form. And the recognition of the category was itself the most significant thing that had happened to her interior since December. She told him about Franklin in February, not all of it, not the full complicated truth, but enough of it that the shape was legible to him. She told him about the meet and the marriage and the first 2 years and the way the third year had been different and the specific quality of a loss that was complicated by the specific quality of what the thing being lost had become in the time before it was lost. He listened with the complete quality, and he was quiet for a long moment at the end. That was the specific quiet of someone who had heard the thing beneath the telling and who was giving it the full weight of consideration it deserved before responding. He said, "You've been grieving two different things." She said, "Yes." He said, "The person he was and the person you had hoped he would continue to be." She said, "Yes." He said, "That's the harder kind." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the second grief doesn't have the same permission as the first." He said, "People understand grieving a person." He said, "People are less certain about grieving a version of a person that only existed as a possibility." She said, "That's exactly it." She said it with the specific quality of someone who has been looking for the language for something for a long time and has just heard someone else produce it. And he received the quality of what she said with the same completeness he always received things she said, which was entirely and without filtering it through any agenda. She said, "How do you know that?" He said, "Because I've been paying attention to you for 11 months, and the shape of what you're carrying has been visible to someone paying the right kind of attention." She said, "What did it look like?" He said, "It looked like someone who was doing the large practical things correctly and who was not yet doing the interior accounting that the large practical things were protecting her from having to do." He said, "It looked like someone who needed the work to be demanding enough that the demanding was the whole of what was available." She said, "And now?" He said, "Now it looks like someone who is beginning to have the interior surplus to do the accounting." She said, "What changed?" He said, "You're asking me that." He said it with the dry plain quality, and she looked at him, and the gray-blue eyes were doing the thing they did when something arrived that the management had not been built to handle, which was showing more than she had intended to show, and she said, "I know what changed." He said, "I know you know." She said, "I'm not sure what to do with knowing it." He said, "You don't have to do anything with it yet." He said, "Take your time." She said, "You keep saying that." He said, "It keeps being the accurate thing to say." She looked at him and said, "You are the most patient person I have ever met," he said, "for the right things." He said it with the warm dark brown eyes and the plain quality and the February afternoon around them, and she held it in the interior place and did not say anything further and did not need to. Because the interior place was full in the specific way of things that had been added to steadily over time and that had, in the February afternoon, reached a fullness that was itself a form of knowledge about where things were going and what they were becoming. March in Ember Ridge had the specific quality of a Colorado high country March that was not yet spring, but that was no longer entirely winter. That occupied the specific transitional territory of a season that had not yet committed fully to what it was going to become, and that expressed this uncertainty in the specific way of mountain weather, which was through variation warm mornings that suggested the warmth was permanent, followed by cold afternoons that clarified it was not. And the light changing in the way that March light changed at altitude, gaining a quality it had not had in February. A quality that was more direct and more honest, and that showed things the January and February light had softened into less definition. Sera noticed the March light with the specific attention she had been giving the world since December, which was more of her actual attention than she had been directing at anything external to the work and the practical requirements of the daily life in the 11 months before December. She noticed it from the east window of the work table in the mornings, and she noticed it on the rare occasions she walked the main street of Ember Ridge for purposes other than the immediate completion of a commercial errand. And the noticing was itself the evidence of what had been changing since December. The evidence of an interior that was producing surplus sufficient to direct outward at the available beauty of the world rather than consuming everything it produced on the management of the forward-facing daily life. She had been thinking about the conversations with Colt in the way that she thought about things that had become the organizing material of her ongoing interior, not obsessively. Thought not with the quality of someone who had lost perspective on the proportion of the thing, but with the specific, sustained consideration she gave to things that she had decided were significant and that deserved the full weight of the thinking. She had been thinking about what he had said in February about the two different griefs, and she had been doing her Hebratronym across the March weeks. The specific interior accounting that the saying of it had opened the door to, the accounting that the work had been protecting her from having to do, and that she was, for the first time in 4 years, doing with sufficient interior surplus to do it without the management. The accounting had been what it had been. She had done it with the systematic thoroughness she brought to all things that required systematic thoroughness, without rushing it and without avoiding the parts that were most difficult. And what she had arrived at the end of the accounting was not a resolution, but a clearer understanding of the specific shape of what she had been carrying, which was a significant change from the unclear understanding she had been carrying it with, because clarity about the shape of a thing was the precondition of being able to set it down. And she had not been able to set it down because she had not been clear about its shape. She told Colt about the accounting on the second Wednesday in March, not in the organized way of someone presenting the results of a structured process, but in the natural way that honest conversation produced, honest content when the conditions for it were right, which was the way she told him most things that mattered. She told him about the specific quality of what she had understood and the way the understanding had changed what she was carrying, and he listened with the complete quality, and he did not fill the pauses with reassurance or direction, but simply received what she offered and was present with the receiving. And when she finished, he said, "How are you doing with the clarity?" She said, "It is uncomfortable in the way that clarity is uncomfortable, when it requires you to see something accurately that you have been seeing partially for 4 years." He said, and she said, "And it is better than the partial seeing." He said, "Yes." He said, "Always." She said, "I didn't know that." He said, "You know it now." She said, "I know it now." She said it with the plain quality she had been learning from him, and he received it with the same plain quality. And the March afternoon continued around them with the specific, indifferent beauty of a mountain march that did not adjust itself to the interior events of the people living inside it. The deepening had a quality she had not anticipated, which was the quality of something that was building her up rather than requiring her to be something she was not. The specific quality of an interior surplus that was growing rather than depleting. The evidence of something that was adding to her capacity rather than drawing on it. She was working better in March than she had worked in any previous month since arriving in Ember Ridge. The specific quality of work that was produced when the person doing it had more available interior than the minimum required by the work. The quality of work that went beyond technical correctness into something that was also genuinely expressive of what the worker knew and felt. The current commission was the best thing she had made since the practice in the previous town, which had been better resourced and more established, and which she had been operating at full capacity before the circumstances that had ended it. And the returning of the quality told her something specific about the state of her interior that was more reliable than any amount of self-assessment could have produced. She told him about the grandmother more in March, told him the specific stories rather than the general warmth, the particular Sunday morning details, and the specific things her grandmother had said that she had been carrying for 5 years without the conversation to put them in. He listened with the complete quality and asked the questions that showed he had been retaining the previous telling and was building his understanding of the grandmother from the accumulated particulars. And the specific quality of his having retained the previous telling was itself one of the most significant things about the March conversations, because it told her that the listening was not the performance of listening, but the actual thing. It was the kind that retained what was offered and added it to the growing structure of the understanding it was building. He told her about his mother in March, told her about the specific quality of a woman who had understood him from early on and who had given him the specific gift of her recognition, which had been the most valuable thing she had had to give, and which he had understood only in retrospect was not the ordinary thing it had felt like in childhood. He told her about his mother's death 4 years before the Colorado move and the specific quality of the grief of losing someone whose understanding of him had been so fundamental to his daily experience of being himself that the losing of it had produced. For the months immediately following, the specific disorientation of someone whose primary mirror had been removed, and he told her about the way the grief had eventually produced not just the loss, but the specific inheritance of the understanding, the way the recognition she had given him had become, over time, something he carried inside rather than something that required her presence to access. She said, "That is a beautiful way to describe grief." He said, "It's what grief does when you give it the time it requires." She said, I haven't been giving it the time it requires. He said, you've been giving it the time you had available? He said, that's different. She said, the distinction matters. He said, yes. He said, you're giving it more time now. She said, yes. She said, I'm finding that the time is available now in a way it wasn't before. He said, I know. She said, I know you know. He said, what do you want to do with the knowing? She looked at him with the gray-blue eyes in the March light and said, I don't know yet. She said, I'm still in the middle of the accounting. He said, take your time. She said, you'll keep coming on Wednesdays. He said, yes. She said, while I'm in the middle of it. He said, yes. She said, that is the most specific form of patience I have encountered. He said, you keep saying that. She said, you keep demonstrating it. He said, it's easy to be patient for the right thing. She said, what's the right thing? He said, you. He said it with the plain quality that made it not a performance and not a presentation, but simply the accurate statement of a thing that was true. And she held it in the interior place with the specific careful quality of someone receiving something that was significant, and that required the full weight of the receiving rather than the managed version. The darkest moment arrived in the last week of March, through the specific channel of the world's indifference to the timing of people's interior processes. Through the arrival of a letter from the county where Franklin had done most of his survey work addressed to Mrs. Franklin Whitfield, which was the name she had been in that county and that she was still legally, but that she had been carefully not using in Ember Ridge, where she was simply Sera Whitfield, the seamstress. The letter was from the county land office and was a routine administrative communication about a survey record that required her signature as the executor of Franklin's professional estate, which was a small remaining administrative matter she had not entirely resolved in the months following his death, and that had been following her through the county record system with the patient bureaucratic efficiency of things that required resolution, and that did not care about the timing. She opened the letter on a Thursday morning and read it with the specific quality of someone encountering the official documentary evidence of a chapter they had been closing. And the reading produced in her the specific quality of the direct encounter with the paper reality of a life that had been hers, and that was no longer. The specific quality of paperwork that reduced the complicated interior truth of 4 years to the official language of legal designation and administrative procedure. She sat at the work table with the letter in her hands for a long time, not crying, because she had not been crying for most of the 4 years, and the not crying had become the characteristic quality of her grief, but with the specific stillness of someone who has been hit with something they had not been braced for and who is in the process of absorbing the impact. She responded to the letter that Thursday with the systematic efficiency that was her default mode in practical matters, writing the required correspondence and signing the required documents with the focused competence of someone completing a task that required completion, regardless of the emotional weight of the completing. And when the letter was sealed and addressed and set on the table for the morning post, she sat back at the work table and looked at the current commission and did not work on it for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about Franklin for the first time in the direct way since the December evening of the lemon cake, thought about him with the clarity that the accounting had produced, which was a different quality of thinking about him than she had been doing in the months before the accounting. It was the thinking of someone who could look at the complicated truth of the thing and see it in its full shape without the management system distorting the looking. She thought about the first 2 years and what they had genuinely been, which was genuinely good, and she thought about the third year and what it had genuinely been, which was the beginning of the specific loss that had preceded the death, and she thought about what the death had meant and what the afterward had required and what she had done about the requiring, which was everything she had done across the 4 years. She thought about Colt. She thought about him in the way she had been thinking about him since February, which was with the full attention rather than the managed attention. The way she had been allowing herself to think about him as the accounting had progressed, and she thought about what he had provided across the 4 months since December, which was not a rescue and was not a reconstruction of what she had lost, but was something specific in its own thing, which was the consistent daily evidence of someone whose quality of attention was the specific quality that produced, in the person receiving it, the specific experience of being known rather than being seen. She had not been known before. She had been seen. Franklin had seen her in the early years, in the way of someone who found what he saw appealing and who wanted it for his own. But the seeing had not been the knowing. Because the knowing required the kind of attention that retained what it took in and built its understanding of a person from the specific accumulated particulars of sustained observation rather than from the general impression of the first taking in. Colt had been building his understanding of her from the specific accumulated particulars for 4 months of Wednesdays. Had been building it from the lemon cake story and the grandmother stories and the Franklin stories and the sewing work stories and the small things she said in the slightly more open mode and the things she said directly and the things she did not say that he had been reading as accurately as the things she said. And the building had produced by March something that was thorough enough to be what she understood the word known to mean when it was meant in the specific way she was beginning to mean it. She had been thinking about this for the rest of the Thursday after the letter, and she had been thinking about it on Friday and into the weekend. And she had arrived at the specific understanding that the thinking had been producing, which was that the thing she was afraid of was not what she was usually afraid of, which was the specific vulnerability of needing someone and having the need produce a cost she could not afford. What she was afraid of now was different. Was the specific fear of someone who had been receiving something genuine for 4 months and who had arrived at the understanding that the genuine was real and that the real was something she was going to have to choose to receive fully or to continue receiving partially, and that the partial receiving was no longer an honest response to what was being offered. She was not ready to stop receiving it partially. She understood this with the specific honest clarity she had been developing across the accounting, not because she did not want the full receiving, but because the full receiving required a completed accounting, and the accounting was not yet complete. She needed more time. She needed to tell him she needed more time. And she needed to tell him in the specific honest way that the situation required, which was not the managed version but the actual version. Because the managed version was the wrong version for what this was. He came on the first Wednesday of April, and she sat across from him with the gray-blue eyes and the specific quality of someone who is prepared for a conversation and who is going to have it in the honest form regardless of what the honest form costs. She said, "I had a letter last Thursday from the county land office," he said. "About Franklin's estate," she said. "You knew about it." He said, "You mentioned it in passing in January." He said, "I remembered," she said. "Of course you did." She said it without irony, and he received it without irony. And she said, "The letter was a routine administrative matter." She said, "It required me to sign some documents, and it required me to spend the better part of Thursday and Friday with the full weight of 4 years in a way I had not been spending time with them." He said, "How was that?" She said, clarifying. She said, "And difficult." He said, "Yes." She said, "I need to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I have been receiving what you offer since December with the specific quality of someone who is receiving it partially, who is taking what is available in the Wednesday form and who is not yet taking what is available in the full form because the full form requires more of the accounting to be done than is currently done." He was still with the full quality of his attention. She said, "I am not telling you this to manage you away." She said, "I am telling you this because you deserve to know where I am and what the partial receiving is about. Because the partial receiving is not about you, and it is not about the quality of what you're offering. And I do not want you to interpret it as either of those things." He said, "I know it's not about me," she said. "I know you know," she said. "I am telling you anyway because the telling is more honest than the not telling." He said, "Yes." He said, "It is." He said, "How much time?" She said, "I don't know." He said, "Is that a problem?" She said, "It would be a problem with most people." He said, "I'm not most people." She said, "I know." She said, "That is the specific reason I'm telling you the truth about it, instead of managing it." He said, "Take the time you need." He said, "I'll be here on the first and third Wednesdays." She said, "I know you will." He said, "And I'll be here on the days in between if you need them." She said, "I know that too." He said, "Then you know what you need to know." She said, "Yes." She said, "I know what I need to know." She said it, and she held his gaze with the gray-blue eyes and the March accounting and the Thursday letter and the 4 months of Wednesdays and the lemon cake and the grandmother and all of it present simultaneously in the interior space. And he held her gaze with the warm, dark brown eyes and the patient, unhurried quality and the specific completeness of someone who was exactly where he intended to be and who had all the time that the situation required. Neither of them looked away. The April light came through the east window and laid itself on the work table and on the sewing work and on the 2 cups of tea and on the small space between their chairs. And the light did not care, and the afternoon did not care, and the world outside did not care, and the 2 people inside the small room above the dry goods store did care. Completely and specifically and without any of the management that had been the primary available mode for one of them for 4 years. And that was in the April afternoon. No longer the primary available mode, but one available mode among others, with the others being the specific ones that were available when the management had been replaced by something more accurate. She said, "Thank you for coming on Wednesdays," he said. "Thank you for opening the door." She looked at him, he said. The first time, he said, in the dust storm. He said, "You could have taken the cake through the door and thanked me, and not asked me to come on Wednesdays," she said. "I know," he said. That was the decision. She said, "I know it was." She said, "I made it with full information." He said, "I know you did." He said, "That's why I'm still here." The accounting finished in May, not on a specific day, and not with any particular announcement. I had finished in the specific gradual way of things that were complete when they were complete, and that did not require the person doing the completing to declare the completion before they were ready, which was the only kind of completion that was real rather than performed. She had been doing the accounting since December, with the specific thorough quality she brought to all things that required thorough attention. And the accounting had moved through its stages at the pace the stages required, and in May, on a morning when the light through the east window was the specific quality of a Colorado high country May morning, that was fully spring rather than transitionally spring, she understood that what had been in process was finished. She understood it the way she understood most important things. Not through the dramatic revelation of a single moment, but through the accumulation of smaller recognitions that had been arriving since March and that had, in May, reached a critical mass that was itself the completion. She understood that the complicated grief was no longer a thing she was in the middle of, but a thing she had been through, not a thing that was gone, because it was not and would not be, but a thing that had been processed in the full honest way and that had produced in the processing the specific clarity of someone who had looked at the thing in full and had arrived at a position from which the looking was no longer the primary available activity. She understood that what she had been building across the 4 months of Wednesdays and the lemon cake and the grandmother stories and the February and March and April conversations was not a replacement for the complicated thing she had been through, but something genuinely different from it. Something that had its own quality and its own shape, and that was not inflected with the specific quality of 22, and the grandmother's death and the need for warmth that had been available in the wrong form. Was not the comfortable replacement of a lost thing, but the specific genuine thing that it was. Which was 2 people who had been paying careful, honest attention to each other for 4 months and who had arrived through that attention at the specific knowledge of each other that was the most reliable available foundation for the thing they were building. She had been building the specific understanding of him across the 4 months, with the same thorough attention she brought to all things she found genuinely interesting. And what the building had produced was the understanding of someone who was, in the specific sense that mattered most entirely, who he appeared to be. He had not been different in any Wednesday than he had been in any other Wednesday. Not different in the quality of his attention, or in the plain, honest register of what he said, or in the specific way he showed up where he said he would show up, at the time he said he would be there. He had not been presenting a version of himself for the purpose of the presentation. He had been simply himself, with the consistent quality of someone whose self was not something they performed, but something they simply were. And the 4 months of the simply being had been the most comprehensive available demonstration of who that self was. She had also been thinking about the smile. She had been thinking about what he had said in the dust storm doorway. Your smile is worth the whole ride. She'd been thinking about it since December with the specific quality of attention she gave to things that had arrived in a form she could not immediately categorize, could not fit into the existing frameworks of her experience with any precision. She had experience with being found beautiful, Franklin had found her beautiful in the early years and had said so in the way of a man who valued the possession of beautiful things and who expressed the valuing in the language of possession. What Colt had said was not that. It was not the language of possession, and it was not the language of assessment. It was the language of someone who had made a specific choice and was explaining the reasoning for the choice in the plain, honest register he used for everything. He explained, and the reasoning was that her smile was worth the whole ride. Which was not a statement about beauty in the way beauty was usually discussed, but a statement about value in the specific way that value was calculated by someone for whom the ride was something you did, when the thing you were riding toward was worth the effort. And the thing that was worth the effort was not her appearance, but her specific response to the thing he had brought, the response that the smile was the expression of. He had ridden 14 miles for her smile. Not for her face, not for the general impression of her, but for the specific, unrepeatable response of her to the specific thing he had thought of for 3 weeks and executed correctly. The response of her to being heard in the specific way he had heard her, to being known in the specific form that the lemon cake was the evidence of. He had ridden for that specific response because that specific response was the evidence of who she was when the management was not operative. And who she was when the management was not operative was the person he had been paying attention to for 9 months before the lemon cake and 4 months of Wednesdays after it. And who she was in that form was, in his accounting, worth every mile of it. She had been sitting with this for 5 months. She was done sitting with it. He came on the 3rd Wednesday of May with the supply list and the specific quality of his Wednesday arrivals, which was the quality of someone coming to a place they had been coming to regularly for months and who had established through the regularity. The specific ease of presence that was available only through the accumulated weight of consistent, honest showing up. She made tea. He sat in the straight-backed chair. She sat across from him. But she did not begin the conversation in the way the conversations usually began, which was through the natural emergence of topic from the immediate circumstances. She began it with the specific directness of someone who had prepared what they were going to say, and who was going to say it in the honest form, without the management. She said, "I have finished the accounting." He was still with the full quality of attention. She said, "I told you in April that I needed time, and that the partial receiving was not about you, and that it was about the accounting not yet being complete." He said, "Yes." She said, "The accounting is complete." He said, "Tell me what it produced." She said, "It produced the understanding that the 4 years were what they were, and that the what they were has been fully seen and fully understood, and is no longer the organizing framework of what I'm doing." He said, "Yes," she said, "and it produced the understanding that what has been happening on the Wednesday visits is something I know clearly and am no longer receiving partially." He said, "Tell me what it is." She said, "It's the thing I've been moving towards since December." She said, "It's the thing you described in the dust storm doorway." He said, "Your smile." She said, "Yes." She said, "But the other direction," he said. "Explain the other direction." She said, "You said your smile is worth the whole ride." He said, "Yes." She said, "I've been thinking about that for 5 months." He said, "I know." She said, "What you were saying was that you had done something for the specific purpose of the specific response it would produce in me." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the response was worth the effort, not because of its surface quality, but because of what it said about the interior of the person producing it." He said, "Yes." She said, "I've been thinking about the other direction of that for 5 months." He said, "Tell me the other direction." She said, "The other direction is that I have been watching you show up on Wednesdays for 4 months. And I have been watching you bring the thread and the book and the conversations that remember what I said the week before, and I have been watching you not press, not rush, not require anything from me except that I be exactly what I am." She said, "And the watching of all of that has produced the same understanding about your interior that the lemon cake was intended to produce about mine." He said, "What understanding?" She said, "That you are exactly who you appear to be." She said that the 4 months of Wednesdays are the same kind of evidence as the 14 miles in a dust storm. That evidence of someone for whom the showing up is not the performance of showing up, but simply what they do, who they are, how they are. He was very still. She said, I've been sitting with that for 5 months, and it has been confirmed by every Wednesday, and every small thing brought, and every conversation that remembered the previous conversation, and it is. In May, the most thoroughly evidenced understanding I have arrived at about any person. He said, "What do you want to do with the understanding?" She said, "I want to stop receiving it partially." He stood from the chair. He moved around the small table with the unhurried deliberateness of his characteristic movement. And she stood because sitting while he was standing was not the geometry the moment required, and she understood this before the thought was complete. He stood in front of her, and he was so much larger than her that the scale of it was simply the physical fact of him being near. And he reached out and took her hands in both of his the way. He took everything he handled carefully, which was with the full weight of his attention and the specific quality of someone for whom the handling was not incidental. He said, "I have been in love with you since the 2nd month. I saw you in the dry goods store." He said, "I know that's before we had spoken, and I know what that sounds like. But I want to be honest with you about it because I have been honest with you about everything else." He said, "I have been watching a person manage something that was too much for one person with a quality of endurance and intelligence that was unlike anything I had observed in anyone. And the watching had produced by the 3rd month something that I understood was not admiration alone, but the specific combination of admiration and the wanting of the thing to be different for her. That was the beginning of what it became." She said, "What did it become?" He said, "This." He said, "What is happening right now?" He said, "What has been happening on the Wednesdays?" She said, "Colt." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have been in love with you since the lemon cake." He said, "December?" She said, "December." He said, "That was early." She said, "I know." She said, "I have been doing the accounting for 5 months to make certain it was what I understood it to be, and not the specific thing I was afraid it might be, which was the old pattern dressed in new clothes." He said, "Is it?" She said. "No," she said, "it is its own thing entirely." She said, "It is the specific thing that is the result of 4 months of someone showing me who they are every Wednesday and not requiring me to be anything other than what I am in return." He said, "Is that enough?" She said, "It's more than enough." She said, "It's the most." He said, "Tell me what the most means." She said, "It means I have never before been in the presence of someone whose specific quality of attention made me larger rather than smaller." She said, "You have been making me larger since December." He said, "You have always been large." He said, "I have just been here while you remembered it." She looked at him with the gray-blue eyes in the May morning light and felt the specific quality of the thing arriving in full that had been arriving in increments since December. The specific quality of something that was entirely itself and that was not a replacement and was not a reconstruction and was not the comfortable warmth that was a substitute for the actual warmth, but was the actual warmth. The specific genuine warmth of being known by someone who had sought the knowing without agenda and who had been patient enough and honest enough and specific enough to provide exactly what the knowing required. He said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Ask." He said, "I want to do this correctly." He said, "I have been waiting for you to arrive at the point you've arrived at, and I'm not going to rush the next part because the next part is the part that determines everything that comes after." She said, "Then take your time." He said, "The irony of you saying that to me." She said, "I learned it from somewhere." He said, "Yes." He said, "Sera." She said, "Yes." He said, "Will you let me court you in the specific form that courting takes when both people know what they are and what they want and are simply working out the formalities of arriving at the thing they have already arrived at?" She said, "That is a very specific way to ask someone to be courted." He said, "I told you I was specific." She said, "You told me that the first Wednesday." He said, "I meant it then too." She said, "Yes." She said, "I will let you court me in the specific form that courting takes when both people know what they are and what they want and are simply working out the formalities." He said, "Good." He said it with the word that was his word, the plain, complete word, and she looked at him and said, "That's your word." He said, "It contains everything." She said, "I know." She said, "That's why I know you mean it." He held her hands for the duration of the moment that the holding required, which was the duration of something being arrived at and registered fully by both people. And she felt the specific warmth of the large calloused hands that had brought a lemon cake wrapped in cloth through a dust storm, and that had been carrying the thread and the books and the specific small evidences of attention for 4 months. And she felt the warmth without the management, and she let it be what it was, which was the warmth itself, simply and entirely. Without any framework applied to it, except the framework of what it actually was. Then she said, "I'm going to make more tea," he said. "All right," she said. "And then I want you to tell me about the north fence and whether you've solved the problem." He said the solution took 3 attempts. She said, "Tell me about all 3. He said the first 2 were instructive. She said they always are. She went to the kitchen, and he sat in the straight-back chair, and she made the tea with the specific domestic ease of someone who had been doing this in this kitchen for 4 months, and who was doing it now with a different quality than any of the previous 4 months. Which was the quality of someone who was doing a familiar, comfortable thing with the full weight of their presence rather than with the managed version of it. Present in the making of tea, in the May morning, in the way she had been learning to be present in things since December, and that was in May. Finally available without the residual monitoring that had been the last remaining artifact of 4 years of careful interior management. The monitoring was done. The accounting was done. The management had served its purpose across the 4 years it had been required and had been replaced. That in the specific incremental way of things that were replaced when the conditions that had required them changed by something that was more accurate to the current conditions, which were the conditions of someone who was standing in her own kitchen making tea in May, for a man who had ridden 14 miles in a dust storm because she had said something without weight about her grandmother's lemon cake. She brought the tea. He told her about the north fence. She listened with the full attention. He told her about all 3 attempts. She asked the questions that told him she had understood the specific engineering of the problem and was genuinely interested in the specific engineering of the solution. He answered the questions with the specific pleasure of someone talking to someone who was actually interested. The May morning continued around them with the specific uncomplicated beauty of a Colorado high country May that was fully spring and fully itself, and entirely indifferent to the specific events occurring in the small room above the dry goods store. And the indifference was the right quality for the morning to have, because what was happening in the small room was not the kind of thing that required the world to adjust itself around it, but the kind that was simply real and simply good, and that required nothing from the external world, except that it continued to be exactly as it was. She thought, at some point in the middle of the fence discussion, about the lemon cake. About the dust storm in the doorway and the cloth and the specific smell that had arrived before she had understood what it was. She thought about the 14 miles and the cake in the saddlebag and the man standing in the December cold with the warm, dark brown eyes that had been entirely certain about the choice they had. Dot made brutal. She thought about what it had meant to be heard in that specific way for the first time, and she thought about what it had produced across the 5 months since. Which was the specific thing that was happening right now, which was 2 people talking about fence engineering in a May kitchen and being entirely, completely without management or reservation. Exactly where they were supposed to be. She was home. Not in the geographic sense, not in the sense of a specific place that had been her home before and that she was returning to. In the interior sense, in the sense of the specific quality of being in the right place at the right time with the right person, the sense that was the adult version of the Sunday morning kitchen in Harper's Mill, which was not the same thing and was entirely in the same register, which was the register of something small and entirely good and entirely safe. She had been looking for that register since 22. She had found it in a small room above a dry goods store in a Colorado mountain town, in the company of a man who had ridden through a dust storm with a lemon cake because she was worth the riding. She said in the middle of the fence discussion. "Colt." He said, "Yes." She said, "Your smile is worth the whole ride, too." "Alles ist." He looked at her across the table with the warm, dark brown eyes and the crow's feet that expressed the warmth in the square-weathered jaw and the specific quality of someone who was entirely at home in himself and entirely at home in this room in this moment with this person. And he smiled the full, genuine smile that transformed his face in the way that full, genuine smiles transformed faces when they were not performed. And she received it with the gray-blue eyes and the full weight of her reception, and she smiled back. the full genuine smile that stopped things, the one she rarely produced, and that was in the May morning above the dry goods store in Ember Ridge, Colorado, entirely available and entirely unguarded. He had been right about the smile. It was worth every mile of it. It was worth considerably more. June in Ember Ridge had the specific quality of a Colorado high country June that had decided to be fully and unreservedly itself. Warm in the direct sun and cool in the shade and the light at altitude that was the specific light of a place close enough to the sky to receive it at a different angle than lower country did. Light that was clear and direct and that showed the valley and the pine ridges and the specific beauty of a place that had earned its beauty through the seriousness of the seasons that preceded it. Sera noticed the June light from the east window of the work table, with the full attention she had been giving the world since December. And the noticing of the June was different from the noticing of the March and the April and the May in the specific way that things were different when the interior condition that was producing the noticing had fully arrived rather than being in the process of arriving. She was not managing herself anymore. This was the specific fact of the June mornings, not the absence of competence or of the practical intelligence that had organized her daily life since arriving in Ember Ridge. Not the abandonment of the systematic thoroughness she brought to the work and the accounts and the running of the practice. Those things were present and were the same quality they had always been, and in some respects were better. Because the work that was done from a full interior was consistently better than the work that was done from a depleted one, and her interior was the fullest it had been since 22. The specific thing that was absent was the management system that had been the primary available protection of the interior across the 4 years. The specific careful architecture of controlled disclosure and managed emotional availability that had been the necessary response to the specific conditions of the 4 years, and that was in the June that followed the May accounting and the May conversation, and the specific quality of what the courting was becoming across the June weeks, no longer a necessary response to the current conditions. He came on the Wednesdays and sometimes on the Saturdays, and the visits had the specific quality of something that was settling into the shape of daily life, rather than the shape of an occasion. Not with the particular ceremony of something being managed into a new phase, but with the natural ease of things that were simply what they were and that were being what they were at the pace that was right for them. She cooked for him when he came on Saturdays because the Saturdays were longer, and she was a good cook in the specific way that had been formed in her grandmother's kitchen, and that had been dormant for years under the specific conditions of a life that had not had the interior surplus to cook for pleasure rather than for function. She cooked with the pleasure of someone who had recovered a skill that was also a form of self-expression. And he ate with the specific appreciation of someone for whom good food was not an abstraction, but a genuine pleasure. And he said the things about the food that told her he was tasting it rather than consuming it, which was the right distinction. She had made the lemon cake in June. Not on a Wednesday or a Saturday for any particular occasion. On a Tuesday afternoon when she had finished the current commission early and the afternoon was available and the specific desire to make it had been present in a way she had stopped managing and had simply followed. She had made it from the recipe she had reconstructed from her grandmother's version, not Mrs. Alderton's version, which was excellent, but the specific version that was her grandmother's, which she had been reconstructing from memory across the June weeks with the specific patient attention of someone recovering something that was worth recovering in the original form. She had made it correctly, had understood this from the smell as it baked, from the specific density of it when she tested it, from the color of the glaze applied warm, the way her grandmother had always applied it. She had eaten a piece at the work table in the Tuesday afternoon, with the lamp burning against the early evening, and she had felt the specific quality of the Sunday morning kitchen. And the feeling of it had not been the grief it had been for 5 years, but something else. Something that was the grief and the gratitude and the presence of the grandmother in the specific way that the dead were present, when you carried what they had given you well enough to produce it again in the world. She had saved a piece for Colt. Not the whole cake. She had eaten her piece and set a piece aside and wrapped it in cloth in the way the wrapping was done, and she had held it when he arrived on the Wednesday with the specific quality of someone returning something that had been lent to them in a form that was better than the form it had been in when it arrived. She had handed him the cloth and said, "I reconstructed the recipe." He had taken the cloth and looked at her with the warm, dark brown eyes and said, "From your grandmother's version," she had said. "Yes." He had said, "How did you know the differences?" She had said, "I remembered them." He had said, "All of them." She had said, "Most of them." She had said, "The butter proportion and the glaze I was certain about." He had said, "What about the lemon?" She had said, "Real lemon." She had said she was very specific about the real lemon. He had said, "Yes." He had said it with the dry, plain quality that connected back to Mrs. Alderton and the December dust storm and the 3 weeks he had held the memory before acting on it. And she had looked at him and said, "You started it." He had said, "I'm glad I started it." She had said, "So am I." He ate the piece of cake at the work table across from her with the same thorough appreciation he gave to things she made, and he said, when he had finished, "It's better than Mrs. Alderton's." She said, "Don't tell her that." He said, "I won't." He said, "But it's better." He said, "It's the right version." She said, "Yes." She said, "I think she would have said the same." He looked at her with the warm, dark brown eyes. She said, "My grandmother." He said, "Yes." He said, "I think she would have been pleased with the reconstruction." She said, "I think she would have been pleased with the reason for the reconstruction." He said, "What's the reason?" She said, "That I have someone to make it for." He was still for a moment with the full quality. He said, "Yes." He said, "I think she would have been pleased with that." The practice had grown through the spring, had grown in the specific way that good work grew in small communities, through the accumulation of reputation rather than through any active promotion. Through the evidence of completed commissions that were visible to the community and that told the community something specific about the quality of what was available in the rooms above the dry goods store. She had taken on her first apprentice in April, a girl of 15 named Clara, whose mother had come to Sera with the specific directness of a practical woman identifying a practical opportunity, and who had been learning the work with the specific absorbed attention of someone who was good at it, and who was beginning to understand that she was good at it. Sera had been teaching her in the specific apprentice way that her grandmother had taught her. Not through instruction alone, but through the demonstration of the work and the patient, sustained attention to the specific quality of what Clara produced. The teaching had been its own form of recovery, had been the specific evidence of an interior that was sufficient not just for the work, but for the giving of the work to someone else. The specific surplus that made generosity possible. She told Colt about Clara on a Wednesday in June, and he listened with the complete quality and asked the questions that told her he had understood the specific significance of what she was describing, which was not just the practical fact of an apprentice, but the interior fact of what the taking on of an apprentice said about where she was. He said, "You're building something." She said, "I've been building something since January." He said, "No." He said, "You've been sustaining something since January." He said, "The building is different." He said, "The building is what's happening now." She looked at him and said, "What's the difference?" He said, "Sustaining is doing what is required to keep the thing operational." He said, "Building is doing what is required to make it into what you actually intend it to be." She said, "And you think I'm building now?" He said, "I think you've been building since April." He said, "The apprentice is the evidence." He said, "You don't take on an apprentice when you're sustaining, you take one on when you have enough to give." She said, "I have enough to give." He said, "Yes." He said it with the plain quality and the warm, dark brown eyes, and she looked at him and said, "You notice everything." He said, "I notice what matters." She said, "I matter." He said, "Yes." He said it simply and without elaboration, and she received it simply and without the management that would have previously required her to deflect it or reduce it or qualify it into something that felt less exposing. It was true, and he had said it, and she received it as true. And the receiving of a true thing as true was itself a form of healing. The specific form of healing that was available when the management system that had been converting true things into managed things had been replaced by something more accurate. He asked her to marry him on the last Saturday of June, at the work table in the late afternoon with the June light through the east window, at the specific low angle of a long summer day in its final hours, and the current commission spread across the table and the tea going cold between them. He asked in the specific form he had described in May, which was the form of something arriving at the formality of a thing already understood, And the asking was in the same plain register as everything he said when the content was important, without the construction of a staged moment and without any performance of the gravity of it, except the specific gravity of his actual attention, which was the gravity it always was. Complete and patient and entirely genuine. He said, "I want to marry you." He said it with the plain quality. And the warm, dark brown eyes, direct and clear. She said, "I know." He said, "I'm not assuming." He said, "I'm saying it because it's what I want, and because I've been working up to the saying for the full duration of the courting, and because May was the month when the formalities became available, and June has been the month when I've been certain the formalities were working toward the right conclusion." She said, "They have been," he said. "Tell me what you want." She said, "I want to marry you." She said it with the same plain quality, as the accurate statement of a thing she had understood since May, and had been holding in the interior place with the specific care of someone holding something that was real, and that was going to require a specific form of courage to say plainly. He said, "Good." She said, "That is still your word." He said, "It will always be my word." He said, "It contains everything." She said, "It contains everything." She said, "Yes." There's a lesson in Sera Whitfield's story that belongs to everyone who has ever been heard without knowing they were being heard. Everyone who has said a small true thing without weight, in the specific offhand way of someone who has given up expecting the small true things to matter to anyone except themselves. And who has been surprised by the specific disorienting warmth of discovering that someone was listening closely enough to hear it and had held it carefully for 3 weeks and had ridden 14 miles through a dust storm to do something about it. The lesson is about the specific form of love that speaks in small remembered things, not in the grand gestures that announce themselves and that require a proportional response, but in the specific careful evidence of someone who has been paying the right kind of attention to you for long enough to understand what you actually need rather than what you appear to need, and who acts on the understanding in the specific plain form that the understanding requires, without ceremony and without the expectation of acknowledgement. Colt Maren had not ridden 14 miles through a dust storm to impress Sera Whitfield. He had not done it to produce a debt of gratitude or to generate a specific social response that would change the nature of their acquaintance. He had done it because he had been listening closely enough for 3 weeks to understand what the lemon cake meant to her, and the understanding had made the riding a simple and available thing. The obvious expression of the specific form of care that was available when attention had been sustained long enough to produce genuine knowledge of another person. The riding was the love made visible, not the whole of the love, which had been building since the 2nd month in the dry goods store, and that had been expressed across 9 months of observation and 4 months of Wednesdays in the thread and the book and the conversations that remembered the previous conversations. But the first visible expression of it, the specific event that took the interior thing and made it available to the exterior world in a form that could be received. And she had received it not immediately, not without the 5 months of accounting that the full receiving required, but genuinely and completely, and in the end without any of the management that had been the primary available mode for 4 years. You have said small true things without weight in the specific offhand way of someone who has given up expecting the small true things to matter. You have mentioned the thing you missed, the thing you had not had in 5 years, the thing that was not about the food, but about what the food had meant. And you have said it to the air, and to the general vicinity, and to the person behind the dry goods counter, and you have not attached any weight to the saying because you have learned, through the specific instruction of specific circumstances, that the saying of small true things without weight was not something that produced results beyond the brief relief of the saying. Someone was in the back of the store. Someone was listening with the kind of attention that retained what it heard and that understood, from the specific quality of the thing being said, what the saying was actually about. And someone held what they heard for 3 weeks and did something about it on a Thursday afternoon when the dust was coming in from the west. And the obvious response to the weather was to stay at the ranch. That is the love that does not announce itself. The love that shows up in the specific form of the thing you needed that you did not know you had communicated. That rides through the dust storm, not for the drama of the riding, but because the riding was simply the available expression of what had been building since the 2nd month in the dry goods store, and that could not express itself on the Thursday, When the dust was coming in from the west, and the lemon cake was in the saddlebag, and the door of the rooms above the dry goods store was waiting to be opened. You opened the door. You held the cloth and smelled the smell, and you felt the specific quality of being heard in the form of a lemon cake wrapped in cloth. And you said, "Come in out of the dust," and you made the tea, and you told him about the Sunday morning kitchen in Harper's Mill, and he listened with the full quality and remembered what you said, and came back on the first Wednesday and the third Wednesday, and brought the thread and the book and the conversation that remembered the previous conversation. And he waited with the specific patience of someone for whom the waiting was not passive, but was the active form of being present to the thing developing at the pace it needed to develop. He was right about the smile. Your smile is worth the whole ride. Not because of its surface quality or because of what it does to the room when it arrives, but because of what it is when it is real and unguarded and produced by the specific thing that produces it in you, which is the experience of being known by someone who has been paying the right kind of attention for the right kind of reasons. Your smile is the evidence of your interior. And your interior, which has been managed and protected and sustained across 4 years of the specific difficult work of surviving something complicated, as the most specific and most valuable thing about you, and it deserves the specific form of attention that Colt Maren paid it, which is the attention that hears the small true things and holds them carefully and does something about the holding on a Thursday afternoon when the dust is coming in from the west. You deserve the 14-mile ride. You have always deserved it. The question was only whether the person doing the riding was paying close enough attention to know what to put in the saddlebag. He was. Open the door. The ride was worth it. You were worth every mile of it. You always were.